Welcome to the Happy Homeschooler Podcast, a digital support group for everyone interested in a learning lifestyle. I'm your host, Holly, and joining us today is our favorite guest host, Jennifer Jones. Hey, Jennifer, what have you been up to since the last time you joined us?
Thank you for having me back. I actually just returned from a 20-day trip with my two teenage boys. So I'm pretty much have been traveling the entire time since I've talked to you. And we just got back and are recovering from that.
Oh, I can imagine there is a lot of recovery if you're gone on that extensive of a trip.
Yeah, there's a lot to catch up on. We had pretty much no internet service the whole time, so it was a true break for everybody. So there was a big to-do list when we got home.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have not managed to go away with and being able to disconnect because I usually have to bring my laptop and combine any vacation with also my work. So my dream is to slot out a whole week sometime in the future where I don't take any technology and we just have a vacation. So that's my goal.
It has a pretty huge impact, I think. My kids actually, they both play a lot of video games and they were, totally fine for 20 days. So it works.
That's good. And I think that's important for our brains to disconnect. I'm trying to, I've started to do that in some small way. I used to play a little card game on my tablet before I went to bed at night, but I found that I wasn't going to sleep very well. And now I just do a crossword puzzle and my sleep is so much better. So that's disconnecting is really important.
Yeah. I think so too.
And so are those the last two kiddos you're homeschooling out of your great big old family?
Yes, they are. They're my last two. I have three that aren't adults yet, but the youngest girl is at college, and they are the only two I'm still homeschooling, and they are 13 and 14. This is the first trip I've ever been on with just those two, just those kids, which was a little odd at first, but it turned out to be really great.
I remember when you and I first met at the academy, I had what was then my two youngest children. I didn't have my little boy yet. And people would meet me and think that I only had two kids. But I had five. And do you find, has that happened to you? Like people meet you and they think you only have these two boys and they don't realize you're this whole big family?
Yes. And it's such really a part of who we are. I don't know when is the right time to say, oh yeah, by the way, I have 6 other children, Yeah,
I experienced that too. It's so good to have you with us to share with us about our topic today, which is traveling while homeschooling.
Have you done any traveling while homeschooling? I don't think we haven't talked about this personally before, so I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I have a little bit. So my middle daughter lives in Colorado, and she just moved up to Granby, which is way up in the mountains. I think they're at 10,000 feet elevation or something like that. But they were living just outside of Denver. And so we had traveled to Denver for spring break when Liam was young. I think he was 5. And then we took a whole month and spent up there in 2018. So we left in 2018, right after Thanksgiving. We went to Arizona because I have family there. We stayed in that area for about 4 days. And then we traveled up and went to the Grand Canyon, which was...
That's great, yeah.
Oh, my gosh. I mean, I cried. It was so overwhelming.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and we take the dog, so he got to go to the Grand Canyon. And it was snowing that day. So it had snowed in Flagstaff, and so it was really amazing. But now we want to go back and see it in another season.
Yeah.
And then we made our way from the Grand Canyon to Durango, Colorado.
I love it there too.
Yeah, it's a really cool little town. And we got there at night. So we went through Four Corners, but we didn't stop. It was like 2 or 3 a.m. And then when we got to Durango, it was at night, and we didn't realize our hotel was at the base of the mountain. So we got up in the morning and looked like, wow.
Yeah.
And then we crossed, we crossed the Rockies. And we're at 14,000 feet. It's starting to snow, and there are no guardrails on some of the sections of that road.
That's so scary.
And I'm on the passenger side, so I can see, down there. Oh my gosh! But it was an amazing experience to drive through there. I don't know if I really want to do that again. But when we finally got to Denver, then we stayed there for a month, and we went to Breckenridge to go sledding, and we went to the Rocky Mountain National Forest, and we went to Estes Park, and
that's awesome.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Oh, just it's just so amazing to be able to do that.
Right. And to share it with your kids, like that's one of the huge things I love about traveling while homeschooling is like that you're both experiencing that, like yourself and the adults and the kids are, experiencing it together. So that awe and the memories you're creating and then you all get the travel bug together because you want to do more and want to see more. It's so exciting.
Yes, we definitely want to do some more trips. We have not been able to recently because my husband had some health issues, and then there's COVID, which makes things a little more complicated. So tell us, where were you traveling for the past 20 days?
So on this trip, we called it the Going North trip. We pretty much went straight up. We went to we usually go to national parks. That's what we focus on. We went to Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. Then we headed up to Yellowstone, and then we were traveling with another friend and her son as well, her teenage son, and we split ways at Yellowstone, and myself and my boys went up to Canada to Banff National Park and Yoho National Park, and then we came back down and went to Glacier National Park and then the Grand Tetons, and then we spent a little time in Colorado visiting our kids, some of my other kids. So yeah, it was a whirlwind. We only had a few days at each park, and we've done trips like that before where they're pretty quick pace, and I like doing that because we see places that then we know we want to return to later, and check out more in depth.
It whets your appetite for the next go round.
Right. And like we did this with a Utah trip a while back where we did the Utah Mighty Five, where you visit all the national parks in the state, and all of us fell in love with Zion. So since then, we've been back to Zion several times to spend a lot of time there. So we do find places that we just, feel drawn to after that too.
That's so cool. And so you had to get passports to go into Canada, or how'd that work?
Yes. So they're pretty strict. We had to be vaccinated, first of all. Then we had to get tested before we crossed the border. We had to have negative test, and they had to be a certain type of test and done in a certain way and at an official place. We had to do that within 72 hours, which was very complicated for us because we were in Yellowstone, which is, in the middle of nowhere, really. So we had to actually drive 2 hours into Bozeman, Montana to get, tested and then drive back to Yellowstone.
Wow.
And then we had to anxiously wait for our results to find out if we could get in. And then at the border was easy. We had that all prepared. So we had passports, we had our testing and our shots. And then within Canada, they were very conscious of COVID protocols everywhere we went. So that's really, traveling is hard right now because every place requires different things, even within the states, each state, each city, they all require different things. So you just have to be prepared and, really look into in advance what it's going to require for each place.
Sure. So did you tent camp in all the parks, or how did you?
Yes. So my family has always tent camped since we've been little. As you know, we have 8 kids, and it's too expensive for us to travel any other way.
Yeah.
Tent camping, especially if you're in parks, is incredibly cheap. It's usually like $15 a night for a spot to camp in a national park. So our biggest expense on these trips is normally gas. We bring all our own food. We really try to budget it out so that we can do these things with all these kids. So we've always done that since they were young. So almost all of our trips have been solely tent camping trips.
That's cool. So do you have a special vehicle that you're using? I know you had a big van at one time.
We used to have a big van. We often like to travel with friends, like other homeschooling families. So we have had trips where we also pull like, a U-Haul thing behind the van. But I, about 2 years ago, downsized to a normal car. and with my boys this time, it was just 3 of us. So we really just used our car and packed in really, really tight. it takes a lot of planning. And for example, we were gone 20 days and we brought all our food for 20 days with us. We also brought all our clothes because we didn't want to, we were so limited everywhere. We didn't want to stop to do laundry or stop to grocery shop and things like that. So it was tight, but we made it happen.
Yeah, we have traveled a bit. We've gone back and forth to Arizona a few times, and then we like to stay at KOAs. They have little cabins. Yeah, right. Well, my husband has a CPAP, so he needs electricity. You know, it would be a good vacation if Dad expired.
No.
So we tend to do those little cabins, but we cook all of our own food.
Yeah.
And yeah, we don't normally do laundry either when we're out. I try to do layers of things so that yeah. You know, and do a clothing color theme, so everything.
On this trip, I joked with my kids. I was like, you know, we're at home. We wear the same shirt all week, so you're going to be fine with just a few shirts for 20 days.
Yeah, Americans are too obsessed with washing their clothes when they're not dirty.
Yes. Yeah, especially a lot of our time was spent in a car between parks. You know, we weren't getting dirty those days. They did each get 20 pairs of underwear.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a necessity. I agree there. So, Jennifer, there had to be a point in your family's life when you and your husband decided that you wanted to incorporate traveling. What was the genesis of all the traveling?
Well, like I said, when the kids were all really young, we just did little family trips, you know, camping trips, and we were always camping because we love outdoors and it's cheaper. But then as we were homeschooling, we, you know, would learn about places in our schooling. And one of the first trips we did that is we were going to the Grand Canyon. Most of my kids were young. I think the youngest was like 1. And on the national parks websites and stuff, you can order, you know, educational supplies to study about the places. And one of the things they had that they still offer at some parks is they have a thing called a traveling trunk. And they mailed us this big, like, trunk full of information and things to learn about the park. And it was super hands-on. And so I decided, well, now we need to just go there, right? We've seen it, we've studied all this stuff. So now we need to go. And that was really the first field trip, I would say, or family trip where it was also incorporated homeschooling. And it wasn't really intentional at first, but it kind of turned into that. Then when I was there, you know, you've been there. So when you go to the south entrance of the Grand Canyon, that's where you first like see the canyon, and it's just amazing first experience, right? So I'm standing there with all my kids. So I believe my oldest was about 12, and they were like, "Oh my God, this is what, you know, what we learned about. Look at how huge it is." You know, they were so impressed. And then there was another family next to us with a couple of kids about the same age, and those kids were like, "Mom, it's just a big hole. I want to go. It's boring, you know."
Oh like, my goodness.
Look
that's
how,
shocking
like,
to me.
So me too. But then I realized, like, what we had done by studying and using it as part of our learning is that the kids felt connected, you know.
Oh, sure.
They felt connected to it. And so after that, pretty much any trip we planned, I worked in some stuff that they would learn ahead of time. And vice versa, any class or subject we talked about, I looked actively for places we could go visit that tied into those subjects. So that's kind of how it started. Also, up until that point, it was all family trips. I had never considered like me going off with the kids on my own. And I met another homeschool mom a long time ago at Austin area homeschoolers. I think one of them used to have a big field day every year, and my kids were still little. I met another homeschooling mom who had just returned from like an 8-week trip with her 2 little girls, and she'd gone by herself. And I was like, wow, I can do that too, you know. So that's when we started like branching out, and then I would do it myself with the kids or join up with other homeschooling friends and families, and we would do it together. We've done a ton of that since then.
Yes, you've done a lot of really amazing trips. Tell our listeners some of the places you and your homeschool group and kids have gone.
Okay, so with the group, we've based them on some of our co-op classes that we've taught with each other. We just have some weekly classes, and we did world history class. And then with that trip, we went on, it was myself and another parent and 9 teenagers that were in the class. And we went on a like 10-day trip to UNESCO World Heritage Sites. We went to Carlsbad, we went to Chaco, Mesa Verde, and Taos. And it was really to see ruins and talk about the history of the ruins. We had each had our own class, and then they would connect together online. And so we went on that trip, and then we went on a Utah Mighty Five trip where that one was for more learning about geology and nature and conservation. We did a world mythology class, and we went on a trip to Mexico and saw all kinds of ruins and learned a lot about the culture. And that one, the kids worked for a year to earn money to pay their own way, to go to Mexico. We did a month-long U.S. history trip like 3 years ago up the East Coast. That was amazing. We visited all kinds of national parks and monuments and museums and really followed like the story of civil rights. We started out down in Montgomery and learned a lot about slavery, and we went all the way up the East Coast, and it was huge. That one was huge. We had about 30 people on that trip, all kinds of families, all ages of kids, and still today, it's all, I think 3 years, the kids who went on that trip talk about it all the time. We've had other little trips that we've done here and there, and some regular kind of trips we do, like going to the beach together and things like that. But those have been some of our big, really impactful homeschooling trips.
Yeah, there's nothing that teaches more than that hands-on first-person immersion. We just had a little tiny experience of that. I've been reading the Little House books to my son, and we went up to Kerrville. We like this KOA in Kerrville. We were taking a little vacation, and there's a museum of Western art. Now, I'm not really that much into Western art, but I said, hey, this is a cool thing to go do. In the museum, they had a life-size replica of a covered wagon and all these different things. We got to put on clothes that looked like, what Ma and Pa Ingalls would have worn in the 1860s. And it really helped him to understand what we were reading about in the books. And this boy is like every night we're reading a chapter. He is so excited about the book and having gone to see those things. And so, maybe not everybody can do a huge trip like you do, but these every area of the country, there are these little resources that we can plug into. It's definitely a learning lifestyle.
It is. And one of the things that we say a lot at our house is that the world is our classroom. That's like, you guys homeschoolers have probably heard that phrase before, but it really, really is our classroom. Yeah. We're out there seeing it, touching it, doing it, and talking to people who've lived through things. And it has a huge impact on all of us.
Oh, yeah. It brings everything to life that would otherwise maybe be a dry paragraph in an encyclopedia, for sure.
I personally was never a history fan until we started doing these kinds of trips. And now I love history because it is the stories. The stories come to life when you visit the places where they happened.
Yeah, and that's another benefit of homeschooling is that you are not only the teacher, but you also become the student. I remember telling someone when I started homeschooling that I realized the first student in my homeschool was actually me.
We're learning more than the kids even sometimes because we're having to relearn the way we were taught things as young kids, and especially with history and how views have changed on history and things like that. We're going out and seeing these things as adults and relearning a whole new viewpoint on all of it as well.
It makes things so much more enjoyable and fresh, and I've always said that the best way to learn is to teach something. That's how I figure out if my kids have learned anything, right? I have them teach me. We're going to take a short break to hear a word from our sponsor. And when we get back, we're going to talk about the logistics of teaching while traveling. The Happy Homeschooler Podcast is sponsored by Transcript Maker. It's an online service that allows you to create professional high school transcripts in the comfort of your own home. Now, Jennifer, have you any experience with Transcript Maker?
I actually have a lot of experience with it. I love the program. I've used it to make transcripts for all of the kids I've graduated, which is 6 kids at this point. And most recently, we used it to create my youngest daughter's transcripts to get into college. And she applied to a lot of difficult schools, and they all accepted the transcripts, and it really, really helped us.
When I found Transcript Maker, I thought, wow, I can take this off my list of things I have to learn how to do, right? It makes it so much easier.
I absolutely recommend it. People ask me about transcripts and diplomas and things like that all the time, and I recommend it to every single person.
Well, I know Transcript Maker has its debt to you because you know a lot of people.
True. And all those people that I've told about it owe Transcript Maker a debt because they have a 14-day free trial, so you can give it a test drive and see how you like it.
And our listeners can save 20% off their subscription when they use our exclusive coupon code HAPPY. That's HAPPY in all caps.
Try it once and you'll be recommending it to everyone you know as well.
Transcript Maker, simply better transcripts. Welcome back to the podcast. In the first half, we talked about traveling and how to afford it and all the benefits of traveling with your homeschooled kids. And in this half, we're going to talk about the homeschooling part of it. So, Jennifer, I know that your family are mainly unschoolers.
We are. Mm-hmm.
How do you incorporate topics and schoolwork into traveling?
Well, so first we always learn about the place we're going to visit before we go. So it kind of piques their interest. I usually give the kids, assignments about like to go find out more and tell us and share what they've found, right? But while we're actually on the trips, the biggest thing is we utilize the resources that the places we go offer. So if we're going to national parks or museums or monuments or things like that, I, ahead of time go on to their websites and I find their educational materials. I find their materials that they offer for self-guided field trips. Most places will have like information you can print out so that while you're there, you can use the most of the space and learn about it as you go. I try to figure out who we can talk to about the things while we're there. You don't necessarily have to sign up for a setup thing, but there's rangers and there's docents at museums and things that would be happy to talk to your kids. So I try to get that all in place while we're going. But as far as like doing formal schooling on the road, that's not really something I do normally. We usually try to fit what we're learning into our lifestyle. So even with math, we're more organic. So on a trip, our math involves a lot of like the kids learning how to navigate and read maps and things, trail guides and things like that. But also part of educational materials we find for parks and museums are usually laid out in the, for school systems. So they will have things like, here's math things you can do at this museum. Here's science things you can do at this museum. So I use that too to fit more subjects in. But I find that when we're on the road traveling, all the subjects I want them to be learning kind of organically take place throughout the process of the traveling and the exploring and the talking to people. I also know families that are more formal in their schooling. And when we're traveling anyways, we have a lot of time in the car. I know homeschoolers aren't, against homeschooling in the car. A lot of people know how to do that and do it between things all the time. So there's also that downtime where you can read and you can play educational games and things like that, while you're on your trip as well.
That makes sense. I know for us, if we're just taking a short trip, we don't worry about getting any schoolwork done. But that big trip where we were gone for about 7 weeks, I did load a lot of the schoolwork books that we were going to read onto my Kindle. Yeah. And I did bring some things like the math, my son's math curriculum, and I think his handwriting, because once we got to the Denver area, we were living there and I was working. So we did kind of go back to somewhat of a regular schedule. Right. Otherwise, he would have had too much time on his hands. And so once we got there, we did do some schoolwork, and we got there in December. So about mid-December, we don't do school anyway. We take our winter break. And so that worked well for us. And I think that, like you, I feel that the experiences that you're going to have and looking at maps and reading information and figuring out, like we taught our son on one of the trips what the mile markers were on the side of the road. Right. And then we told him, okay, well, it's so many miles. And he was able to watch for that. And he'd say, oh, we're going to be there in a certain amount of time. Or he started to figure out how much time it took to travel a certain distance. And those are all really important things that we're going to use in our whole life. And so there's no reason to do a worksheet about it.
Right. It's like everything else. If you're learning it while doing it, you connect to it and you remember it and things like that. And I think even along the trip, like what you were saying is a good example, that you figure out things that maybe your kids don't know, like while you're traveling, because it's outside of your comfort zone. It's a new location and they ask questions. So then you can follow up with that and they can learn new ideas and new concepts from that as well. But we always throw something educational in there anyways. This trip in particular, the boys are in a teen book club, and so we listened to the audiobook while we were traveling so that they could be caught up on that. We also listened to lots of podcasts that were relevant to the classes that they're starting this year in their co-op, and just took advantage of any downtime we had just to continue learning.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and audiobooks are such a useful tool.
They're great.
They're great, and I use them a lot now in my homeschooling because I am the main income earner for my family, so I have to work.
Right.
And so sometimes when I don't have time to read a book aloud, I'll bring my son into my office and we'll put it on and listen to it together. Yeah. And so, audiobooks are great, and podcasts. Wow, what a treasure trove of information.
So the podcast. So on this trip, and this usually happens on our trips, we do end up doing things that were unplanned, that we just like see or hear about and go, oh my gosh, I want to go do that. So then we'll add things into our trip. On this trip, we started listening to a podcast called National Parks After Dark. A little bit of background before that my kids are taking the whole high school co-op session they're taking this year is all about crime, criminal psychology, criminal forensics, true crime stories. So that's kind of the focus of the high school group this year. So this podcast, National Park After Dark, each episode is about a park, and then it tells you something that's happened there, something bad, or, either like a murder or an animal attack, it sounds gruesome, but it's not really. It's very educational and interesting. But it also is relevant to what they're studying this year, because there's like rescue stories and stuff. But there was because of listening to that podcast, almost all the locations we ended up going and seeing things that the kids had heard about on the podcast and they really wanted to do. For example, one of the podcasts was about an alien situation, UFOs and things that from the 1950s in the Great Sand Dunes area. And in that episode, they talked about that there's a UFO watchtower place where you can go there and see all the stuff people say they've discovered and everything. So we went there and it was so interesting. And another example is there was a ghost story about a hotel in Banff, and the kids were really interested in finding that out, And I know it sounds like it's just fun stuff, but really with the ghost stories, they were learning history about the people there and, things like that.
Yeah.
So we went to the hotel. Totally not in our plans, but they asked hey, can we go see that haunted hotel? So we went and did that, and saw the place where they talked about, and so we, even along the way, we learned new things by listening to podcasts and then discovered new things we wanted to see, and it made it more exciting for us.
Well, and that's the thing is that, your experience at the Grand Canyon where your kids were excited and the other kids were bored. When you give kids some kind of ownership or some kind of connection, they're really excited. I think that if I had said to Liam, let's learn about covered wagons and blah, 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 he wouldn't have been too excited. But we were reading a book about some characters, and then I said, hey, we're going to go to this place, and they have a covered wagon in there.
Right.
He kept going back into that covered wagon. I think he probably got in it 5 or 6 times.
On our U.S. history trip with all the other families, I think Amanda, but her daughter was with us, and she had been in our history class, and I think she was 10 maybe at this time. And we went there and we had written papers in that English class about people in history and stuff. And I believe she had picked Clara Barton.
Okay.
And we went to the Smithsonian, one of the Smithsonians, the history one, I guess. And they had Clara Barton's original covered wagon there.
Wow.
And the look on her face when she walked in the room and saw that was amazing. She was just, so that was just a huge moment of her just connecting with, I wrote this kind of boring paper, wasn't really that interested, and now I'm seeing it, and she was just so excited about it.
Yeah, that is
cool
really
to see them do that.
That's awesome. I have a funny story, but it shows that maybe it would be a good idea to do some research before you go on a trip. We like to go to Galveston. We go to Galveston as frequently as we can. And when we went there last year, we were out in the water playing, and my husband was on the beach. And all of a sudden, he says to me, like in a really urgent voice, like, Holly, you and Liam, come here. And I thought, well, my goodness, I don't know what's going on, but that his voice sounds a little upset. So we start coming up, and I said, what's going on? And he says, I see some fins out in the water. So Liam gets terrified. He practically runs on the water to get out of the water, thinking there are sharks. But, a little research would have reminded us that there are dolphins.
Dolphins.
Yes. And so then we realized, oh, no, those are dolphins. And my poor son needed a lot of convincing to get back in the water. It's just a funny family story. But a little research about what might have been expected would probably have been helpful.
We have a lot. We go to the beach quite a bit, and it's never like a planned educational homeschooling type of trip, but we still always learn a lot. Kids are always finding, things on the beach that we're like, don't know what that is. What is it? And so then they go and we go to the National Seashore. So they take things to the rangers, and ask like, what is this? And we've learned so much through them just asking questions on our trips.
Yeah. We were reading the book by Holling C. Holling Pegu last year. It's about a little hermit crab. And so on our last trip to the beach, we found a blue crab, and my son was real excited about it. And then we saw some people catching something on one of the stone piers. And we went over. I was just talking to anybody. And like, hey, what are you catching over there? And he was catching shrimp, and he had so many shrimp in this bucket. And we had, read about the shrimp, and, it's a great gift to your kids to give them that curiosity and expose them to things so that they can appreciate when these things come up.
Yeah.
So you sound like you do more of your research and actual schoolwork before you go on the trip.
Yes. Yeah.
And then what do you do when you come home? Do you do anything post-travel?
The biggest thing we do is we talk to people about what we did, and the kids really talk to people about what we did. And we, share pictures with friends, and then the kids remember it and they share that experience. And so when we've done group trips with other homeschool families, they continue that conversation afterwards, or they find things along the way that they want to learn more about, and then they'll do that on their own afterwards too.
Yeah, I think traveling is awesome. And wasn't it Mark Twain that said, he had a great quote about traveling. He said, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on those accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime.
Yeah,
that's from The Innocents Abroad. Yeah, it's really so true.
I grew up as a military brat. My dad's in the Air Force, and we lived all over the world. And as an adult, I've really appreciated it in relation to this quote. Like, I've been exposed to so many different kinds of people and cultures and ideas and, religions and customs. And when I meet people who haven't traveled, I see that they're missing those experiences in their life view of other people. And I've always wanted, to give my kids those options so that they can see people differently, and just be aware that there's all these differences out there and that it's okay.
Yes, it's really important. It's given us a lot of a different viewpoint and a different mindset.
I agree. And people don't need to do what I'm doing and go far away and all of that. But I live in a very small town out in the hill country, and I know a lot of people here who've never been into Austin, which is an hour away. They've never done that. So even in your own area, your own state, just, once in a while, step outside of your city, your town, your community, and just see other people and see other ideas out there.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money.
No,
there's so many things that are free or low cost. Yes. Speaking of free and low cost, have you ever camped in the Bureau of Land Management areas? Because they don't charge, right?
Yes, we've done some of that in Colorado and Utah. Sometimes they charge. They're really cheap, like $10 a night, and sometimes it's just find where you want to go. Those are really primitive. That's not for everybody.
Right.
Very primitive. But I wanted to mention, and talking about free things, that if you're not able to travel, if you're tied to work, or, I'm lucky enough that my husband is here working and okay with us going on these trips. But if you're not able to do that, there's a lot of virtual field trips online that you can do and still take you, to those places, and so that kids can see them. Even seeing them online is more than just reading about it in a book.
Mm-hmm. We did take advantage of some of those virtual field trips when COVID first started. One of the things I like to do is either to stay in the little cabins that I mentioned, the KOA cabins, or to get Airbnb where we have the whole house. And those are such affordable ways to travel if you're not a tent camping kind of a family.
Yes.
So one of the other things you were saying about how your boys thought something looked familiar when you were traveling, and our listeners might remember our game schooling episode where we mentioned Assassin's Creed.
Yes.
So do you think that maybe they recognized something from having played Assassin's Creed?
It's definitely possible, because a lot of the places we visited looked that way, had that look to them. I think a lot of the games they play do, with the big mountain backdrops and the forest and, things like that. So even just seeing those things in their games, those things that you can see out in the real world, is amazing to them.
Here at the end of our podcast, we usually have a big question, but today we're going to be talking about some big homeschooling news from around the world. So we'll start here at home. Last year, when the pandemic started, there were only about 5% of children in the U.S. being homeschooled. But that has changed, hasn't it, Jennifer?
It's changed greatly. Now it's doubled to 11%. That's a huge jump in homeschooling, and I don't think that's been really seen before.
No, homeschooling hasn't really been growing that fast, but we have a lot of factors that weren't really a factor previously.
And I do think that the pandemic has really been the driving force behind the increase. Definitely people, would either are pulling their kids out of school because they're not happy with the COVID situation. But I also think more people have heard about homeschooling because of that. So there's been other people just encouraged to look into it as well.
Yeah, and I think another part of the rise of homeschooling is that people had an experience of distance learning through their public schools. And they found that while they may not have appreciated the way their schedule was set up,
or how it was presented to them,
or how it was presented, having the kids home and having more time together was really appealing.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of them have really found that it's something they enjoy. I think a lot of them have also discovered it's not what they expected it would be. I don't think a lot of the people who started homeschooling this year or over the last year may have known what they were getting into, and they thought it might just be this, virtual thing you do online, but there is a lot more to it. And I think they're finding that along the way.
Yeah, I think one of the other things I'm seeing is that homeschooling is growing faster in some parts of the country than others. So this one news story said that in Florida, homeschooling went from 5% to 18%.
That's amazing.
It's a huge jump. And then in New York, it went from 1% to 10%. And New York is a hard place to homeschool.
Right. That's huge too.
Yeah.
It does make me wonder, this increase makes me wonder if states are going to take a closer look at it and create more regulations for people who are choosing to homeschool. Even things as far as checking in on child welfare. If there's that many kids out of the school system where they do normally check on welfare of kids, are states going to feel obligated at this point to start checking in more on homeschooling families?
Yeah, as a person who started homeschooling here in Texas before it was completely legal, and all the work that we had to do to get our rights to homeschool, I'm wary of increasing regulation.
I am too, yeah.
Yeah, and I hope that all the people who are listening, whether you're an established homeschooler or a new homeschooler, you'll be paying attention to that. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, we did, Melody and I did a whole episode called Homeschooling in the Dark Ages. And you can go back and listen to that and find out what it was like before homeschooling was really legal.
Yeah. I don't know where it goes from here. I'm really interested to see if the majority of the people who've started homeschooling will stick with it, if it will be a long-term thing, or if this is just a temporary increase due to COVID situations.
I'm seeing that people are asking a lot of questions about how they can get their kids back into school next year.
Yes, I've
So it
seen
makes
that
me
too.
feel like it's a temporary thing. However, again, like people found with the virtual school, they're going to find out things about homeschooling they didn't know, and maybe they will get into it for the long haul.
Yes, I hope so. I hope some of
Yeah.
them do.
Yeah, so homeschooling is growing in the US, but in France, sadly, they just passed a new law in July which restricts homeschooling there.
Yeah, I just heard this news. I was really surprised to hear that. And honestly, I don't know what their homeschooling policies were before, but totally outlawing it is very surprising to me.
Yeah, they are going to allow some exemptions for reasons of health or disability or artistic or sports practice. It says something about family homelessness. So I guess they have some exemptions, but I am a Francophile, and I do know that the French mindset is that it's very important in France to be French and to be part of the culture. That's why their kids are such good eaters, which doesn't really have much to do with homeschooling. But the whole culture, they start teaching kids to eat all kinds of foods when they're very young, and they make it a normal thing.
Right.
And so people in France don't have a lot of problems with their children eating a wide variety of things like we do here. So their whole culture is about being one homogenous people. And I think that they feel that homeschooling did not promote that. And they also they've had a lot of immigrants to their country, and they want the people that have emigrated there to also be incorporated into the French way of life.
Right.
So I think that's the main thing. I know that HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, actually monitors homeschooling in other countries.
Right.
And they are actively watching what's happening.
I haven't looked into it in a while. Earlier on in our homeschooling experience, I did, look into how other states and other countries, what their regulations are, in case I ever want to move anywhere. But so I haven't checked on it lately. So I might do some more research myself and see like how it is being handled with this huge increase here in the United States, if other countries are also seeing this, or if they're handling the school situation differently than we are here right now.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. And I remember telling my husband when we first started homeschooling that there were several states where if he were to be offered a transfer, we would not go.
We couldn't go. It's still true for me.
It'd just be too onerous to try to homeschool with all those regulations. And a lot of people think that regulations make the homeschooling better. But I had a friend who homeschooled in New York and also in Pennsylvania, two very highly regulated states. And she would always tell me that I was able to do a lot more with my kids because we didn't have to satisfy certain rules and regulations.
Yeah.
So I'm really, when you don't have as many rules and regulations, you work so much harder to give your kids this really great education, because you don't want anyone to look at what you're doing and think that you're shortchanging your kids.
Yeah. And you have the freedom to then do what your kids need, focus on the things they need. And that's really helpful. I know some states, I think some states still require only a certified teacher to teach in homeschooling, and they allow usually someone to oversee a parent, but there has to be a certified teacher in charge of their education. So each state is very different on how they hold up the homeschooling regulations. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes going forward.
It will, and I think we should all be vigilant to keep an eye on how the government is responding to the increase in homeschooling.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully we'll get more support and not in a negative form.
That would be nice. If you have any questions, comments, or homeschooling news, please email us at happyhomeschoolpod@gmail.com.
And go like the Happy Homeschooler page and join the group on Facebook at facebook.com/Happy Homeschool Pod.
Check out our Instagram at instagram.com/Happy Homeschool Pod.
Or follow the podcast on Twitter at _homeschoolpod.
And subscribe to the Happy Homeschooler Podcast on YouTube. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Holly.
And I'm Jennifer.
Happy homeschooling. Hi, this is your host, Holly Williams Urbach. Thank you for listening to the Happy Homeschooler Podcast, a Transcript Maker production. My guest host today was Jennifer Jones. This episode was produced by Matthew Bass and edited by Norah Williams. Our graphic design is by Pete Soloway, and our music is by the Great Pangolin. You can find her music on YouTube and Twitter at Kylie Wins. That's Kailey Wins. If you'd like to help our podcast grow, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Or as always, tell people about us.